Hi there, I'm Arif Fahruddin. In this podcast by my colleague Rajeswari Ramani spoke to the CEO of the economic think tank Center for Market Education, Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, who told us why producers are facing high prices in food production and how consumer interests could be safeguarded.
Hello, Dr. Carmelo. Welcome to our Asian Agribiz podcast about how regional food and meat producers are combating inflation.
Hi, and thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to have the chance to share my thoughts on this topic with you.
Great. Let's go on to our first question. In the light of recent challenges faced by producers, how did you see them maintain their profitability while at the same time combat aspects of inflation?
Well, it is absolutely not easy for them because despite the general belief that producers just transfer their price increase, the rising costs that they face on their selling price, there is obviously a limit to the size, to the dimension, to the pace that at which they can do this, which is the market. So you can't transfer automatically your cost increase on the selling price because the final result may be that consumers are not able to purchase your price. So I believe that in this current moment, the possible strategies are obviously to be extremely prudent on investment, to make steps only when profit expectations reach a certain degree of certainty, and to try to move in the direction of increasing productivity, so to spend, to invest in the direction of getting higher amount of products with less employment of inputs. Obviously, this is a process that can't happen overnight, can't involve the whole producer, and it will probably affect and it will probably determine a restructuring of the production process and the whole value chain.
Okay, when we are looking at restructuring the value chain and the production structures, do you also see that some of the producers might actually start using, like, let's just say, like a different ingredients, or to be like a cost worthy, maybe decrease some of the high cost that they have, and perhaps like maybe the quality of the products might go down. Do you see that?
Yes, I think it is a possibility. For sure, what is going to happen is a generalized openness toward new solutions that may be an higher increase of technology, or trying new technologies, trying new raw materials, eventually cutting out labor, long-term solutions. But again, of course, there is a natural limit at this. Ultimately, there are certain things that need to be used for the production and cannot be eliminated or skipped. And obviously, this kind of long-term restructuring happens when there is the belief that a change is there to stay, and when there is the belief that this kind of changes are in general beneficial for the production process in terms of profitability.
Okay. And we at the back end, at the industry level, know why food prices are high, but most consumers might not understand that, especially for those who don't have access to detailed information. So as a producer, let's say a chicken farmer, how would you safeguard consumer interests and make them understand why prices are high?
Well, I think that I may have to contradict you. I don't think that there is a general awareness of what are the causes of price tensions. There is a blaming on the Ukrainian war, or international tensions, but this is only a part of the story. First of all, supply chain disruptions started much earlier than the Ukrainian war. And if we look not at CPI, not at the consumer price index, but if we look at the producer price index, we see important price tensions arising already in 2020. And in fact, the Center for Market Education, which I lead, started to warn about a high inflation coming at the beginning of 2021. We kept on saying if certain policies keep on being adopted, namely lockdowns, and therefore expansive fiscal and monetary policies accompany lockdown, we are going to have a very fragile recovery, which will be followed by an inflation-led crisis. We said that at the beginning of 2021, not later than that. So inflation was coming. I think policymakers were blind or pretended to be blind in this and kept on implying policies that did not have any medical benefit, but instead produce huge economic losses. And particularly, if we remain at the topic of inflation, we have inflation defined as a generalized and permanent price increase in prices only when the quantity of money increase at a faster pace than the output, than the GDP. And this is what is creating inflation, not the war. The war is a temporary phenomenon that can add to that, but raw materials have been stressed by supply chain disruption. But ultimately, what is making these price tensions permanent and generalized is the fact that governments around the world produced an amount of money higher than the growth of GDP. This is the true and only reason behind inflation. Behind inflation, there is always a monetary cause. The other things only bring in a restructuring of the relative prices. So inflation is a monetary phenomenon. And unfortunately, policymakers around the world are trying to deny this and to blame someone else, but they and their central banks are the actual culprit to be blamed on the origin of inflation.
That's really interesting, and that kind of like brings me to the next one. Next question. So we have seen some extreme measures taken by governments around the region and the world. Some look like they are protectionist as well, like price ceilings, export bans, tariffs. But as you say, this is not healthy, and it doesn't actually safeguard the consumers because now we're facing inflation. So what other solutions can we look at that they should be doing or looking at?
Well, in fact, the solutions that have been adopted demonstrate that there is a very poor understanding of what inflation is, or at least the pretension of a poor understanding, because usually policymakers tend not to want to blame themselves. So if, as it is, inflation is a monetary phenomenon and is caused by an excess of money in circulation within the economic system, the only solution to cut inflation, or at least to stop its growth, is to cut the quantity of money in circulation. So how to do that? One attempt is now undergoing with the raise of interest rate, but I'm skeptical that this can produce fast and important results. The necessary measures that we need is first of all, to reintroduce fiscal discipline, so spend according to what we have at government level. And second, to cut government spending, in particular for current expenses rather than investment expenses. So as far as we don't see a cut in government spending, we will not see a deceleration on inflation. Obviously, these measures will have a contractionary effect, but you can't break the eggs and pretend to put them together without a certain amount of pain. Now the eggs have been broken, the milk has been spilled, and to reverse the process is always a painful process.
Can we actually reverse the process?
I quite doubt so, because politicians tend to want to be re-elected, and to cut government spending is quite an unpopular measure. At best, probably they will halt the phenomenon. So the international tensions will produce, together with higher interest rate, a sort of economic crisis, and this may have a deflationary effect. So we may have some partial effect due to generalize difficulties. But to go back to the pre-COVID prices, I think at this point is not going to happen.
Yes, that sounds very sensible. Can you give us some examples of how governments in the region, let's just say a bit of a comparison, how did Singapore do it? Did they do it successfully, or how did Malaysia do it, or how did Thailand, facing inflation and trying to cut costs and at least safeguard some consumer interest in this case?
Well, I think that more or less nobody is doing anything. They are mainly hoping that the central bank raising of interest rates, that is something that is happening more or less everywhere, is going to produce some effect. So in this, each government is copying the other government. So there is a lack of fantasy, if we want, while other measures that have been introduced, like subsidies or ceiling price, are actually going in the opposite direction, because they subsidies are inflation, because they are more money introduced into the system. Ceiling price are blocking supply for stepping up, or when supply is not allowed to step up, that price tensions are just prolonged. So I have the feeling that all the measures that have been implemented to try to fight inflation are only making the situation worse. And nobody has really the courage to recognize the origin of inflation, and therefore to take the necessary measures by blaming the mistakes that they did in the past 2 years, and therefore to try to correct that direction.
Just a question about technology. Is there any way that technology, e-commerce, digitization actually can play a role in facing the high food prices, or decrease them, or is it even possible, or will we as consumers be facing with long-term effects of the food, especially food price inflation?
Well, just a little remark. So food inflation or food price inflation is, I would say, not an appropriate terms, in the sense that inflation refers particularly to a generalized price increase. So I would rather use the expression food price increases or price tensions. Having said that, technological development is often a chance for prices to cool down through the increase in productivity. Like I mentioned earlier, so an increase of productivity is a way to cool down prices, but obviously these are processes that require times to happen. So we cannot expect radical technological changes to happen and to be adopted in a general way in a matter of few months. So we need years to get this, to have these processes to be accomplished. And I do believe that unfortunately, because of the quantity of money that has been produced during the great lockdown, part of this inflation is there to stay. So we are not really reversing the process. I think that at best now we can try to slow it down.
Okay, and you were saying that the using technology is also going to help that as well, because it's going to increase production.
Yeah, productivity.
Productivity.
Is going to, so the output in relationship to the input. So yes, it's going to happen, but again, I mean, it's going to help, but takes time.
Would you say this period of time is can be seen as some kind of a revolution in industrialization?
No, I don't see I may be wrong, but I don't see a sort of Schumpeterian technological jump happening
Yeah.
in this moment.
Mhm.
I can see for the agriculture, for the food industry, probably an attempt, in example, to change the formula of feed or to go in this direction. But again, this is something. These are processes that require investments in R&D and can only produce effects over the span of a few years. So let's but every kind of technological change needs years to be adopted and digested. But I don't see a Schumpeterian jump in this moment.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Carmelo, thank you for coming on board today to speak to us about what you've seen around the region on general inflation and how producers have or will handle it and what will happen to the economic landscape of the region in the next, I would say, at least maybe 1 to 2 years.
Yes, thanks to you. Thanks for having me, and I hope that it was useful for the listeners.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another edition of Asian Agribiz podcast. We hope you can use the insights presented here to your advantage in facing the current economic challenges in food production. We will bring you more insightful podcasts to help you navigate this testing time. Stay tuned. I'm Arif, signing off for Asian Agribiz.